Welcome to Carol and Gary's See America Tour. Hello again, everyone. Carol, Jasper, and I made it to sunny Biloxi, Mississippi on November 11th. It was 70 degrees when we arrived. Mississippi is the 32nd state that Carol and I have visited together. I spent 12 months in electronics school at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi shortly after enlisting in the Air Force in 1973. I returned several times during 1979 to attend additional electronics classes, and then again for 12 months in 1983 to help keep the electronics equipment running that the students were being trained on. You'd think it'd be enjoyable to return to an area where you once lived to see if things have changed. But unfortunately, a young lady named Hurricane Katrina got here before us. 14 years before us, in fact. Everyone has heard of the damage caused by Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, but most of the damage in New Orleans was caused by a levee being breached, not the hurricane itself. Category 5 Hurricane Katrina left a 450-mile wide path of destruction along the entire Gulf Coast. Biloxi was a town with a population of just under 50,000 people when I was stationed here in 1973. Biloxi sits on a peninsula that is approximately 20 miles long and is 20 feet above sea level. Remember that elevation. As we drove around Biloxi, it was amazing to see all the empty lots in the areas that once contained houses. Hurricane Katrina's winds reached the Mississippi Gulf Coast at 2 a.m. on August 29, 2005, with 120-mile-per-hour sustained winds that lasted for 17 hours. Remember when I said that Biloxi was 20 feet above sea level? Hurricane Katrina had a 28-foot storm surge that completely covered Biloxi and flooded 6 to 12 miles inland. People who were unable to evacuate survived by climbing to attics or rooftops. Waves damaged many historic buildings and destroyed others. This is traffic on Highway 90, a 4-lane road that runs along the Gulf Coast in Biloxi. Everything above the highway in this picture is Biloxi. Everything below the highway is the beach along the Gulf of Mexico. There are several hundred feet of beach between the highway and the water. Several casinos that were operated from barges anchored offshore were picked up by the 28-foot storm surge and pushed ashore, knocking down houses as they came. Here is where one of the barges came to rest after the storm surge receded. At the time Hurricane Katrina hit, Mississippi law said that the casinos had to float on water or be built on piers to keep them physically separated from nearby communities. There were 24 dockside casinos in Biloxi and neighboring Gulfport when Hurricane Katrina hit. These casinos generated $1.23 billion in revenue during 2004, the year before Katrina hit. 14,000 casino employees were suddenly out of jobs, although many were actually paid until the end of 2005. Storm cleanup wasn't yet in full swing when Mississippi lawmakers and the governor approved changes to the state gaming laws, allowing casinos to move off the water as long as they built their casinos within 800 feet of the shore. The change was intended to be an incentive to rebuild, and the industry did just that. Within days of the law passage, several gaming companies announced plans to recreate their damaged casinos on dry land. On Tuesday, November 13th, Carol and I visited the Biloxi Visitor Center, where we picked up a map for a walking tour of the historic buildings of Biloxi. The first house that we saw was the Clements House, which was built between 1846 and 1852. This house is a Greek Revival design. As you can see, this is a single-story framed residence. Emma Clements acquired this house in 1869, and her descendants lived in the house until 1959. This is one of the earliest houses in Biloxi. It was added to the National Registry on May 18, 1984. The second building that we saw was the Cathedral of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. This church was built in 1902 in the late Gothic Revival design to replace a church destroyed by fire in 1870. The stained glass windows were imported from Germany in 1906. This church is the home of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Biloxi. This building was also added to the National Registry on May 18, 1984. The next building that we saw was the famous Magnolia Hotel. Built in 1874, the Magnolia Hotel is the oldest tangible reminder of the early days of the resort industry in Biloxi. The Magnolia Hotel has a mortise and tenon pegged frame with bricks between the posts. one of the earliest forms of building on the Mississippi coast. This building was added to the National Registry on March 14, 1973. This is the Redding House, built by Charles Redding, a prominent businessman, in 1908. It is one of the finest colonial revival houses remaining in Biloxi. A prominent feature of this house is a circular motif, particularly in the forms of porches and the projecting bay on the west side. This building was added to the National Registry on May 18, 1984. This neoclassic building is currently the Biloxi City Hall, but it was built between 1905 and 1908 as the Biloxi Federal Building, housing the U.S. Post Office, Courthouse, and Customs Office. The brick building is faced with fine grayish-white marble. The arch motif is carried around the building with arch windows and fan lights over the doors. Inside are marble floors and original woodwork. This building was added to the National Registry on January 30, 1978. After our walking tour, we decided to drive around and see what had changed since my last visit to Biloxi and if any other remnants of Hurricane Katrina were still evident. While I was stationed in Biloxi, my daughter, oldest son, and I used to drive out onto a pier and go fishing. The pier was actually a bridge across the water that was damaged beyond repair by another hurricane, so they built a turnaround at the end of the bridge so that people could safely access the bridge for fishing. You used to be able to drive out onto the pier, but now the entrance is partially blocked by a casino. The reason hardly anyone is fishing from the pier today is that it is very windy. A cold front is passing through. Temperatures are expected to drop to 28 degrees tonight. The tall bridge off to the right was built to replace the bridge that we were driving on. We have reached the end of the bridge, so we have to turn around, but first this is another look at the bridge that was built to replace the bridge that we were driving on. We were told that this bridge sustained major damage during Hurricane Katrina, but has since been repaired. After driving on the pier, we drove to the Biloxi Lighthouse. The 64-foot tall lighthouse was erected in 1848 and was one of the first cast-iron lighthouses in the South. It is the city's signature landmark and has become a post-Katrina symbol of the city's resolve and resilience. To build the lighthouse, metal plates were bolted together to form the lighthouse, and then bricks were used to line the inside. The light was civilian operated from 1848 until 1939, and it's notable for its several female lightkeepers, including Maria Youngins, who tended the light for 53 years. In 1939, the U.S. Coast Guard assumed responsibility for the light's operation. After being declared surplus in 1968, the Biloxi Lighthouse was deeded to the city of Biloxi, which eventually opened to the public. The lighthouse has withstood many storms over the years. Katrina's storm surge enveloped one-third of the 64-foot tall lighthouse, and the constant pounding of the waters and winds toppled many bricks that lined the interior of the cast-iron tower. The storm's winds also broke many of the windows in the cupola and destroyed the structure's electrical system. In March 2010, the city reopened the lighthouse to public tours after a 14-month, $400,000 restoration. On November 15th, Carol and I toured Beauvoir, the post-Civil War home and presidential library of Jefferson Davis in Biloxi, Mississippi. Jefferson Davis, if you don't recognize the name, was the president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. I'm not going to refight the Civil War here, but we have learned that the Civil War was fought primarily because of views on slavery. Jefferson Davis believed that since the states had voluntarily joined the Union, that it was within their right to leave the Union if they desired. Mississippi seceded from the Union on January 9, 1861. Jefferson Davis, who at the time was a U.S. Senator, resigned from the Senate and shortly thereafter was elected President of the Confederacy. To put it bluntly, the South was doomed from the start. The North had vastly greater industrial capacity, built nearly all locomotives, steamships, and industrial machinery, and had a much larger and more integrated railroad system. Nearly all the munition facilities were in the North, while the critical ingredients for gunpowder were in very short supply in the South. Jefferson Davis and his wife were captured by Union forces on May 10, 1865. On May 19, 1865, Davis was imprisoned at Fort Monroe, Virginia. After 2 years of imprisonment, Davis was released and later pardoned by President Andrew Jackson on Christmas Day, 1868. After the death of her husband in 1875, the widow Sarah Dorsey learned of the former Confederate president's difficulties. She invited him to visit the plantation and offered him this cottage near the main house where he could live and work on his memoirs. He ended up living there for the rest of his life. Ill with cancer in 1878, Sarah Dorsey rewrote her will, bequeathing her entire estate, including Beauvoir, to Jefferson Davis. He would live at Beauvoir until his death in 1889. Beauvoir was heavily damaged by Hurricane Katrina. Our tour guide said that the storm surge made it to 18 inches above the first floor. It has been interesting returning to Biloxi after being away for more than 30 years, but seeing vacant land in areas that once contained houses and businesses has been sad. 52 people lost their lives in Biloxi during Hurricane Katrina, so you know when we get to Florida we will be monitoring the weather closely. And with that, we need to get packed up today so we can leave for Florida in the morning. If you like this video but have not yet subscribed, please do so to be notified of future videos, and as always, feel free to share with your friends. Thanks for watching.